Welcome to Paranormal M, where the eerie and mysterious come to life. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to keep up with our latest spine-chilling tales. Get ready for an unforgettable experience. A not-so-brief history of the paranormal encounters of my life. I, a 43-year-old male, have experienced some strange things in my time. What follows are my first-hand accounts. Approximate age, 4 years old. One night while sleeping at the foot of my parents' bed, I woke and I looked out into the hallway. Slowly walking towards my own bedroom door, which from left to right in the hallway was a hooded figure. They were about 3 feet tall. I walked slowly. The hood seemed to be made of old or worn leather. I didn't look my way or anything, but just proceeded to walk towards and into my room. My parents eventually split, but my mom kept the house and still lives there today. My younger sister also reported seeing a transparent floating woman in 1800s period clothing. That was in her bedroom one night in the same home. I also experienced other incidents in that home. Approximate age, 6 years old. I was having a bad dream one night. A large purple, funny I know, but a large purple monster just tying me up on my neck and leading me around like a dog. I still vaguely remember the dream and the aftermath to this day. I woke in my father's arms in the living room. That was after sleepwalking. I had tied a toy jump rope around my own neck while fully asleep. I walked down the hallway holding the rope with one hand. Approximate age, 12 years old. After getting off the school bus one afternoon, I went inside like normal to spend a couple of hours alone before my mom got home from work with my sister in tow. I was watching TV. Thought I heard a noise in the house, and I muted the TV, didn't hear anything else. Went back to watching TV, and thought I heard something else. I turned off the TV and I just sat still, listening for a few minutes. I got up and started slowly walking from the living room towards the hallway. The first door on the left is a door that leads down into the basement that runs the entire footprint of the house. I stood at the basement door for a moment, silently listening for any sounds. All of a sudden, I heard footsteps. They were coming up the wooden steps. The sound was distinct and unmistakable. I slapped the side of the wooden door and shouted, "Hey!" Bolted back through the living room and out of my front door. I ran up to my grandfather's home up a path of about 100 yards or so. Got him to go back with me, explaining what had occurred. We started by rolling up to the garage door entry door to the basement from the outside. The door locked prior to us opening it. We slowly made our way through the basement, checking the few dusty windows and other single-entry doors. All doors and windows were shut. They were also locked. No signs of forced entry or normal entry. In fact, there's no sign of anyone or anything being in the basement that afternoon, especially capable of making heavy footfalls. Approximate age, 23 years old. While laying in my girlfriend's bed one night, that was in her parents' home, I was swimming in my own thoughts. I was regarding these things that had to do with our relationship and the state of it. On one hand, the way I was raised said that the things I was doing at the time weren't quote-unquote good. On the other hand, I was in the process of half-heartedly exploring the history of religion and spirituality. I was busy trying to resolve basic human emotion and desire. Long story short, I couldn't go to sleep. I did something I never really did. I lobbed up a prayer, if you would call it that. Basically asking the universe to send me some kind of a sign or something of the things that I was doing, that they were okay. A few moments later, I felt my spinning mind was easing up a bit. I was slowly getting closer and closer to being able to actually fall asleep, and then bam! I heard a voice. The voice said clearly and distinctly, Galatians 5:17. I was instantly awake again. I shot upright listening. Physically got out of bed and went to the window to see if somebody was outside. Everybody else in the house was long asleep. Somewhat panicked and freaked out, I returned to the bed. I pondered the significance of what had just taken place. I was half scared, half bewildered. told myself that if what had just happened had some sort of validity, I would investigate further in the morning. It took a few minutes, but the calming and relaxing feeling returned, and I just wound up drifting off to sleep. The next morning, I remembered the events of the night before in detail. I didn't say anything because it kind of freaked me out still. When I got to work that day, I approached a coworker whom I assumed carried a Bible with her regularly. I flipped to the verse. I was floored. "For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. Therefore ye should not do what thou would." It was basically a direct answer to the question I had put forth. I still get chills telling the story to this day. However, I didn't really change much in my life then or at any other time. I think that led to the next event. Approximate age 24. A year later, I still somewhat was conflicted about the previous event. Things that were taking place in my life too. My girlfriend and I had moved into an apartment together. We had to make some pretty tough personal decisions that year, but I was becoming somewhat conflicted with where my life was headed. Pretty much I was in a pretty big bout of depression. As usual, all of this was pretty much internalized and kept inside, so that my suffering had as little impact on others as possible. Outside, I was the easygoing, laid-back guy that everybody could rely on for help or laugh or a combination of all good things. Inside, not so much. I hadn't tapped the ether of the universe since the previous incident. Partially out of fear and partially out of pride and skepticism. Well, this particular night I was once again struggling with a bout of insomnia. I decided that maybe it was my time to lob up another request. In so little words, I subconsciously said, "I feel alone. If there's anything else out there, I could use another sign that I'm not." That was it. There was no voice, but sleep did finally come. The next morning, pulling out of our apartment complex and heading to work, I immediately get behind a little red sedan with a license plate that says PSALM 121, Psalm 121. I noticed it immediately and laughed to myself, partially at the coincidence and partially out of skepticism. When I got to work, I again went to the same coworker that I knew likely had a Bible in her purse. I flipped to Psalms and was once again floored at what I read. In the most basic of translations and interpretations, it talks about not being alone and that the Lord watches over you. Now, paired with the previous incident, you would have thought I would, repent and become some sort of born-again Christian. I've actually kind of done the opposite and often criticize modern religions and consider myself an agnostic to this day. I clearly haven't won the lottery yet, so I guess that's the universe's way of humbling my often antagonistic approach to understanding the unknown. I guess I believe in personal spirituality and all that, but am sort of an eternal skeptic when it comes to other people's paranormal experiences, religions, and anything outside of what I consider quote-unquote normal. I don't know if it's because I'm an anti-authoritarian by nature or what, but for whatever reason, I often find myself only believing what I experience in my own existence. I would say that that's most people. Or, more than a spoonful. Ghost, clone of coworker. The place I work is an old 3-story house in the downtown, downtown adjacent area of the city of Mississippi. I'm guessing a city in because Mississippi's a state, but I'm not sure when it was built, but it was added onto over multiple occasions through the years. It was a private home, a restaurant, a law office, and possibly other businesses that I'm not aware of as well. Since 2014, it's been the main office for my job. In general, it's an old building that makes old building sounds from time to time. For a long time, I was often the first person here. I was also among the last to leave. I've heard what sounded distinctly like voices upstairs when I knew for a fact nobody else was there. Others have reported similar sounds. One evening in September of 2015, Toys R Us held a Force Friday event for the release of new toys and merch for Star Wars. Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Two coworkers, I'll call them David and Ronnie, decided to meet at the office after work and ride together to the event. I forgot exactly what time the event started, but it was late enough that we all went our separate ways and we ate dinner before meeting back at the office. I was the first to arrive back at the office. Pulled up, parked it, and went into the parking lot, and I noticed Ronnie. He lived close enough at the time that he walked to and from the office rather than driving, so the lack of his vehicle there wasn't really unusual. They were walking up to the front steps, and he, I assumed, went into the office. I did notice that he was wearing different clothes than he'd worn at work that day. I didn't really think much of it. I got out of my car and headed to wait for him, David and his wife. I got to the door, threw it, and it was locked. I thought Ronnie had just locked it behind him as like a joke or a prank or something on me, and didn't have a key to the front door. I parked in the back a lot during work hours. I knocked. Ronnie never appeared. I decided I'd return to my car, and when I did, I looked and saw Ronnie walking up the sidewalk from his apartment. He's wearing the clothes that he'd been wearing at work that day. Well, I decided not to say anything. I guess you could say I was noticeably uneasy because he asked me what was up. I was explaining what I saw. David and his wife arrived, and I told them as well. We decided to search the area. Our office is fenced around two sides, so we split up thinking that if somebody was there, they had gone around the building. They wouldn't have anywhere to go if we headed them off from both sides. We went in the back, none of us having seen anyone else. We kind of wound up shrugging it off, or at least they did, since they didn't see anything themselves, but still bothered me. Months later, maybe even a year later, the event really wasn't fresh in my mind at all anymore. I got to work early on a Monday morning, as was usual at the time. Did my usual round of turning on the lights and unlocking the front door from the inside before heading back to make some coffee. I noticed Ronnie was standing over by the copier. He was facing away from me, assuming he must have come in while I was going around turning on the lights, because I turned the security system off when I entered, so nobody had beat me there. I said, "Good morning," and continued walking to the kitchen. He didn't wind up replying. I assumed that he just didn't hear me. Later that day, not having really thought about it again, I asked Ronnie's wife. She also works with us. I asked where he was because I needed his input on this project. She said that he was at home, sick. I asked what was wrong with him. He had seemed fine when I saw him that morning. She said that he hadn't been there at all, and that he'd been gotten sick over the weekend. A year or two later, a similar incident happened. Got to work early, and after I'd made coffee, I saw Ronnie waking up in the steps, or not waking, but rather walking up the steps to the second floor. Well, that's good. But then a few minutes later, he and his wife arrived to work. He was wearing entirely different clothes. I had told a few people at work about the incidents, but they all just considered it a good spooky story to share around Halloween time. That was until earlier this year. Until then, I was the only one who had seen the being that we've dubbed Other Ronnie. Or at least, the only one to share the story of it. But then one day our project manager, I'll call him Wade, he saw it. Wade isn't necessarily a no-nonsense type of person, but he's not really the type to just make stuff up either. He left something upstairs when he left to go home, so he came back, and when he got to the office, it was after everybody else had gone up and locked up. He went to grab whatever it was that he had left. He noticed Ronnie was sitting at a desk upstairs, facing a computer. He said, "Hey." He didn't get a reply, but went to the restroom. When he went to head back out, he noticed Ronnie was gone, though the door had never made the ding sound it always makes when it opens. I haven't seen Other Ronnie since then, yet, but I do occasionally think about it, and I'll kind of keep an eye out for it. A few things of note. It's always wearing jeans, which Ronnie often, but not always, wears. It's always been facing away, and neither Wade nor I saw the face, but overall just looks like the exact same build and size and hairstyle of Ronnie. He never speaks or seems to really do anything. The only time that's ever been in any motion from Other Ronnie was when I saw it walking up from the front step the first time. Curious if anybody has any idea what this might be, or if you've experienced something similar. Childhood paranormal encounters. I listen to podcasts while I work. I've recently been listening to Morbid. I heard about a theory that children, especially those who are distressed or displaced, tend to be able to interact with or notice entities that adults may not be able to. I'm not sure about the validity of it, but it made sense to me and applied pretty well to my own experiences. I'd like to start off by saying that as of now, I find it very hard to believe in the paranormal. It's not for lack of trying. I find the paranormal extremely interesting. I always have. But outside of the experiences that I had when I was little, I've never seen anything since. This reason is why I tend to believe the theory about children being more perceptive to the paranormal. I no longer have experiences of this kind now as I'm an adult. I'm very much a see-it-to-believe-it sort of person. It annoys me immensely that I'm this way, but it's how I am and I can't seem to change it. Although I experience no paranormal activity currently, I did a lot when I was little. And I'd also like to clarify that I've never had a history with auditory or visual hallucinations, or nobody in my family has either. Even as a child, I was doubtful and pretty overly rational. I've never been able to explain away the things that I've experienced. I've lived in many homes throughout my life, as my parents liked to buy old foreclosed homes, fix them up, and then sell them. I only had an issue with one house in particular. I'd guess I was in middle school, but definitely on the younger side. The first time I walked into this house, I was immediately put off by something I couldn't place. It was a small or medium 2-story house with an unfinished basement located in a very shady neighborhood. Well, that's what I used to think. At first I had no reason to explain why I didn't like being inside the house. Eventually, though, strange things started to happen to me. One time I was in the house alone. I was playing in my room and I heard somebody calling my name. This wasn't a mumble or the TV or anything like that. It sounded exactly like my mother, and at the time I didn't know I was alone in the house. I got up to go see what my mom needed. Unexpectedly, I couldn't find her. I was about to go back to my room when I heard her call my name again. This time I was in the kitchen, where the door to the basement was. I knew for a fact the voice had come from the basement, and I didn't like the basement. I was scared of it, and really any basement in general. I was hesitant to answer my mom's call. I opened the door, peeked down the staircase, and noticed that none of the lights were on. It was pitch black down there. I doubt you'd be able to see anything without a flashlight. I got even more creeped out, and I was pulling back and closing the door, and I heard her call my name again. Then again, and it was definitely coming from the basement. My stomach fell to my ass. I decided that I needed to get out of the house immediately. I burst out the front door, and I find my mother outside watering a rose bush. She had earbuds and listened to music. I stop her and I ask her. I ask her outside and I ask her if she was calling my name. She tells me that she wasn't, and she's been doing yard work for a couple of hours. I was fucking freaked. Refused to go back inside without her. Still wasn't satisfied even after she went down to the basement and declared nothing was down there. I never heard that call again, though. The rest of my experiences kind of blend together. They most often happen at night while I was in bed and my mother was asleep. The only reason I was awake so late most nights was because I was truly terrified to close my eyes. I would hear things at night, like voices and steps. I would get so terrified I would sneak into my mom's room and sleep on the floor next to her bed so I didn't have to wake her up. First, the steps. It was always around the same time in the morning. 1 to 2 a.m., I think. I would hear somebody walking up the stairs, pause, and then walk back down. This would happen a couple of times before it stopped completely. Didn't hear it again until the next day. It wasn't every night, but it was a lot of them. I never got up to see what it was because I knew for a fact it wasn't my mom, the only other person who lived with me. I wasn't really interested in meeting whatever was making the noise. I always pictured a little girl in a nightgown. I'm not sure if that's just a horror movie influence or if it was somehow picking up the thing like how it actually was. Additionally, the spare bedroom upstairs had a door that led to the attic. In case that glitch just caught me off guard. Additionally, the spare bedroom upstairs had a small door that led to the attic. I would hear similar steps above me on the wood beams. They'd be placed above the insulation. Next, the voices. This was the tipping point for my mother, I think. She was getting increasingly annoyed with how terrified I was almost every night now. I would always end up waking her up and would ask her if I could sleep in her room. And for some reason, she really didn't like letting me in there. Thought forcing me to stay in my own room would make me more brave or independent or something. At one point, she put, our 2 dogs in my room with me before bed to put a little bit of a gate up in the doorway. That way, they would stay in the room with me all night. It was supposed to be comforting, but it wasn't. The voices I would hear would come from my closet. I was sure that they sounded like children. I would simply hide under the covers and shake until I somehow eventually fall asleep. But the night my mom had her dogs stay in my room with me, they heard them too. They were growling at my closet and pacing in front of the gate, just crying to be let out of the room. They wouldn't come anywhere near my bed because it was right in front of the closet. They would always stay on the other side of the room. I never once checked the closet at night, and again, I didn't want to know. The last thing I can remember is that my favorite stuffed animal, the one who I slept with, the one that I hugged to my chest every night without fail, they ended up on the other side of my room in my rocking chair in the sitting position. She was one of those robotic dogs that barked and wagged its tail and shit. So her front legs were adjustable and you could have her laying down or sitting up. It wasn't really easy to adjust her legs either. It wasn't like I accidentally moved them to the sitting position as I slept. Though I know that I hardly move in my sleep anyway. I went to bed with my Stuffy hugged against my chest facing the wall and my bed against with the Stuffy laying down, but I woke up the next morning, it was missing. Thought she'd fallen off the bed, so when I turned around to look, I found that she was now sitting upright in a rocking chair staring at me. After that, I became extremely scared of her. I'd only ever say nice things to her, so I thought I needed to appease the ghost I thought that was maybe inside her. I actually still have her to this day. I'm still pretty scared of her. My friends all know who she is and actually equally terrified of her, but I'm just too kind of sentimental to send her away. Those are the experiences I can remember. Hope I've posted this to the right subreddit. If not, please let me know and I'll do my best to adjust it. I posted this because I wanted to ask what other people thought of what might happen when I was little. My mom ended up sending me to therapy because of how scared I was all the time, but no matter what the therapist did, he could never really help me get over the fear or the experiences. But they didn't stop until we eventually moved out of that house. Disturbed something in an old cemetery. I've developed an admittedly odd hobby of scouring old offline maps, weird findagrave.com entries, and local history books to locate forgotten or abandoned cemeteries and counties that I live in. When I'm lucky enough to find one, I'll go out to it, take photos to upload into findagrave.com. Add the place on Google Maps so it doesn't get lost again. Too morbid to many, but for me, it's pretty good reason enough to go out and have an outdoors adventure with my kid. That's pretty cool. Earlier this year, I visited a pioneer cemetery dating back to the mid-1850s. Most of them in this part of Texas do. I went out, took my pictures, and I left. I was the only one there, and it was small, with only one family buried in it. Some research indicated that the family patriarch founded the first ever pharmacy in town. No weird feelings, no seeing ghosts, nothing like that. Just a peaceful, short visit. As I was trying to fall asleep that night, I was trying to think about the day's activities. My thoughts went to the cemetery, then to a little bench that I remember from the middle of the cemetery, then to a man sitting on the bench. A man with no face. In my memory, this man was sitting there facing me. They were dressed in old-timey dark clothes and wearing a dark top hat. He was tall and thin, a white guy, tanned. When I tried to picture his face, all I could see is a blank slate. No features. Like a mouth from a portrait. Still a head there with hair and a hat, but nothing else. This memory was accompanied by a very strong feeling of presence. Like more than just a hollow memory. The only other time I felt this way was the evening of my grandfather's funeral. That night I dreamed that my grandfather came by to say goodbye to me. He didn't say anything that I remember. Instead, he just smiled at me and just kind of hung out in my dream a while. The memory of this weird old guy on the bench in that cemetery just felt like this dream of my granddad. That was weird, thought to myself. Figured I was imagining things. I was still wide awake at this point, so I tried my hardest to forget about it and to go to sleep. I didn't think about it again until the next day. That's when I was walking down the stairs of my house into the living room. That's when I glanced briefly, just at the fireplace, and I was struck by that same feeling. The one of the old guy's presence from my dream. This time it was also accompanied by what felt like a strong curiosity. The feeling lasted for maybe 30 seconds, then it was gone as fast as it had come. It's never returned. For context, I don't have any run-ins with spirits ever, other than the dream of my grandfather. I haven't experienced anything like this before or since. And the way it felt as it was happening was so bizarre. It felt tangible, more than any of my other random fleeting thoughts or daydreams ever do. It felt real, even though there was nothing there in my living room. I either imagined all of it, or I was followed home by an old man's spirit who was curious about me. It's likely the former, but the possibility of it being the latter gnaws at me. Still on the hunt for, forgotten cemeteries. Hopefully I'm alone in my memories of the next ones I visit. That's a cool hobby. I believe I've seen ghosts. Gonna start this off with an I do believe in supernatural entities, be it ghosts or fae. This world and universe are too big for me to not think that there can't be at least a chance of these things. I've always seen things out of the corners of my eyes, but like everybody else, I'm just like, oh, that's a bug, or maybe a cat. Sometimes I know what I saw. One thing that really sticks with me was in 2022. I went to my great-grandma's funeral. She went by Gigi, so it's easier to tighten. She was a sweet and kind soul and always patient and loving with us kids, so a large portion of the very big family flew in for her funeral, myself included. During the ceremony, I watched everybody else, my dad, brother, aunt, grandma, as they all went up in front of the little hut thing that we were at and said words about her. Each time I watched this image of her in my head, not something I could physically see, but I could feel, like watching her comfort my aunt and telling her not to cry, hugging my dad as she sang a song to her. And as the ceremony was wrapping up, I saw her go to the side with my great-grandpa who died when I was younger, so I don't really remember him. The two flew off as doves. Literally, they were a pair of doves that were hanging around and took off. I know from my dad that we've had what he calls witches in our family lineage, which I interpret as high energy for spirituality or whatever you may call it. So I was talking to my aunt about me seeing her at the funeral, and that's when one of my cousins, who was distantly related, came up and asked if I saw her. Apparently they had seen her too, and I confirmed I did. We started talking about these things and what happens at the funeral and other things that we've seen throughout life. Shadows and other ghosts. Part of me says that I have hallucinations about, like, once in a while, maybe due to an act of imagination, but the other part loves this little thing I can do. It's scary at times, but it's my best memory when it comes to the paranormal. I don't know if this helps people or if it's just another person rambling, but that's my experience. We're all a person rambling at some point. Headless Ghost Encounter. Me and my buddy were riding home through the woods in Alabama. We're going down a rural patch of road on an old highway. We'd been hunting that morning and we didn't end up killing a deer, so we decided to go fish and grab some food. The morning hunt felt strange, as if I was being watched in the woods. I'm a police officer and a retired Marine. I don't get spooked easily. A pack of wild dogs ran through where my stand was. I kept feeling that burning feeling of being watched, prompted me to leave early. The dark woods of Alabama is a scared place. After the hunt, we fished at the pond, and in a while we returned home. On the way home, we ran into something I've struggled with since that day. It was exactly 12 noon when we saw it. Before I get into the incident, you need to know some history about Baldwin, Alabama. The Battle of Blakely was fought along this particular highway. This battle was a bloody onslaught that occurred at the end of the Civil War. It resulted in immense casualties. Now on to what happened. We were around mile marker 18, and to the right there it was. On a grassy embankment and a curve in the road, just past an old bridge that we passed, stood a tall black horse. It had a rider wearing black armor. It had black gloves gripping his horn on the saddle with a sword sheathed. This dark rider was massive in figure and missing its head. You heard me right, a headless horseman. The horse was abnormally large and was darker than night. The rider stoically sat in the saddle facing the sword as if he were waiting on something as we drove past. Now I don't spook easily, and my buddy doesn't believe in anything, well, like that. As we passed the horseman, time seemed to slow down as I sucked in every detail available. I remember everything about it. My buddy also stared in disbelief as we seemed to glide past the safety with the truck, like some sort of safari from hell. Now here's where it gets weird, if it wasn't weird enough already. So when we passed it, it looked back in the mirrors and just poof, it was gone. And this area was rural. The horseman couldn't have come from anywhere or be headed anywhere that fast. My friend told me shortly after that he didn't want to speak about it ever again. He was shook up. It wasn't until later that he recounted his story. Well, we saw the same thing, all up until we passed the horseman. His account was that the horseman was on the left side of the road and slowly walked into the center of the road and disappeared. I saw him clear as day on the right side of the road. Anybody else seen him? Let me know. An experience I still think about. Anybody who comes across this is going to be long. When I was younger, like 3 to 5, I had massive stomach surgery. I almost died because of a tumor in my stomach. When I was finally healed, we had moved into my grandparents' old house. I'd never sleepwalked before, but when we moved, I would sleepwalk to the basement and pee down the stairs. Weird, right? Not paranormal. Maybe the introduction of a new home caused it. Maybe it's because I was so young. My family has native heritage, but I was and still am the whitest kid in the block. We have a chest down there for my fully native great-great-grandfather. We believe that it's haunted with something bad, but I'll start the story now. When I was 5, I had fully woken up because I had to pee. Something was different. I felt watched and I felt like I was going to be heard. It was the first time I ever felt something like that, hair raising and all. I couldn't comprehend. I saw my door open by itself and I was floored. I sat up in bed and I heard a little girl giggling. I tried to get up to see who it was, but as I did, I was shoved back super hard into my bed and I bounced on the springs. It felt like a massive hand. I screamed so hard, ran to my parents to tell them, and I slept with them that night. There's something malevolent in my parents' toy room this day. We've laid salt and we've had others comment on it, saying that they won't go in there without knowing about it. I have more stories about that room that are worse, but this is my first paranormal experience. If you made it this far, thank you for reading. Only people who believe me are my family, as they remember me screaming. I personally think that the house itself isn't haunted from a dead person. It was built in the frickin' 90s. My parents are the second owner after the grandparents. Nobody's died there, but I can say that it's charged with horrible, horrible energy. How to fix this? What does it mean? My friend and I found a broken mirror in the middle of the woods. I took a shard of it home with me. That was like 2 years ago. Since then, really strange things have happened to both of us. One of them was last year on Halloween. We were walking along in the woods at night. That's when suddenly my friend said that she saw something behind us. All you could see was a dark shadow, maybe as big as a dog. But when I put my flashlight on it, it started growing taller and became a man. He then started walking towards us, and he was about to pass by us. I wanted to apologize for pointing the light directly at his face, so I said, "I'm sorry." The moment those words left my mouth, he abruptly halted and really, really slowly turned around. Never in my life have I felt so much danger emanating off of one person. While turning around, he had a huge grin on his pale face, made my heart drop. He then stood in front of us grinning, eyes wide. After some time, he turned around and walked back away into the woods. I don't want to sound weird, but he didn't seem human. Something was just so off about him. And also, we live in a small town, and you usually know the people you pass in the street, at least by sight. We've never seen that man before. So let me explain how I think that connects to the mirror. Both of us always felt a sort of draw to that place in the woods, so we frequently went there. Each time we'd go a bit farther. One day we found this path, but when walking along it, noticed that it didn't lead to anywhere. When we walked back, we found the mirror leaning against a tree. After taking the shard, while walking back, my friend heard a small voice say, "Help me," out of the underbrush. We were both freaked out by it, so we sped up our walking and continued. That wasn't the last time that we'd been to that place. But recently, whenever we plan on going there, something happens to stop us, like a thunderstorm or us feeling incredibly tired all of a sudden. Long story short, we think that maybe we unleashed something by touching that mirror, and especially by me taking that shard home with me. Maybe something else along with it. Or maybe those strange things aren't happening because of that mirror. I feel I should mention that my friend has visions from time to time that more often than not come true. We both feel haunted to some extent. It feels like there's a presence in my house. I hear noises or see shadows which often cause me to believe that there's an intruder in the house. Additionally, I have really disturbing dreams. A week ago, my brother heard me screaming in the middle of the night saying that I was being watched. When he told me in the morning, I couldn't remember anything about it. Does anybody know what this could mean or know any rituals? Not sure I believe in that sort of thing, but I want to find out what's been happening to me. What do you think about the mirror? I don't dream every day, but when I do dream, it's a nightmare. I know that one day I'll no longer remember this. I know that I will grow up and have more experiences to tell. It all started in my childhood. I was 9. I was on a remote road with a lot of trees, which would have been physically cold. I don't remember exactly, but I felt warm. A few meters away, there was an abandoned ambulance on the road. As a curious child, I went in. Inside, it seemed bigger than the most common ambulances, as if I had been teleported to a room in a morgue or something. I looked at the sink, and there were traces of blood. A few seconds later, I heard the laughter of a newborn child. I looked behind me, and there was a mark with something that resembled a human, only wrapped in a typical hospital sheet. Underneath, there were 2 things wrapped in garbage bags. They moved from side to side. They were small, like newborn babies. Without thinking much, I went to the mark and removed the sheet that covered the thing. It was a rag doll that looked like Annabelle, the real one from the museum. I immediately went out the door and ended up in the same place I started. In front of me, I came across 2 faceless creatures, white as light. They looked like 2 boys. One who looked older said, "What are you doing here? This is not your place. Do you see this road? Run until you reach a hole, and you'll go back to your world again." I did, and I really did go back to my bed. This is the most enigmatic one. I don't even know what I looked like, especially. But I'd like to remember that I was in a place where the walls were white and beige with pastel-colored polka dots. Everybody was wearing 60s-style clothing. It was a birthday party, and the table was huge, by the way. There were a lot of children, but for some reason I was invisible. I don't remember everything, but I remember a guy came in, curly hair, black, like a mask. It was covering only everything below his eyes. Navy blue coat, white collar, black jeans, black shoes. Couldn't explain it, but nobody noticed him. To me, he had red flags. For some reason, he took a sharp object and murdered through one of those in that room. When the last victim died, he looked at where I was. That's a weird one. The Haunting Phone. Today I want to share a scary story that my father experienced a few years ago. It's one of those stories that gives you chills just thinking about it. I think this is the perfect time to tell it to you. So a few years ago, my father lived in a fairly isolated house in the outskirts of town. It was an old house, a little bit out of time, surrounded by fields and forests. The neighbors were far away. The house was not very well lit at night. You see, the kind of place where the slightest noise seems strange. One winter night, my father was home alone. My mother was away on a work trip. I was staying with friends for the weekend. My father decided to relax for a good book, a fire, cup of tea sort of thing. It was the kind of quiet evening that he liked. Around 10 p.m. while he was immersed in his reading, the landline rang. It was strange because at this time he wasn't expecting any calls. I went to answer, but there was no one on the line, just a heavy silence. A little bit worried, he hung up and went back to his business. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, there was a voice on the other end of the line, but it was so quiet that he had trouble understanding anything. He tried to speak, but the line went silent before abruptly going dead. The phone continued to ring all night. Every time he picked up, there was no one. Or sometimes, incomprehensible murmurs. The worst part was that the calls seemed to come from the same number, the number he didn't even know. After about 10 calls, he decided to unplug the phone to try to have a quiet night. The calls didn't stop. In fact, he noticed that the sound of the ringing was coming from upstairs in the master bedroom. He was sure that it wasn't possible that the phone couldn't ring if the cord was unplugged. It was extremely disturbing. Just then he heard a strange noise coming from upstairs, as if somebody was moving slowly, dragging their feet. My father took a flashlight and went upstairs to check. He found nothing unusual in the room apart from the landline phone, which was now covered in dust as if it had never been touched. When he came downstairs, he saw that the calls had stopped, but the atmosphere had become even more oppressive. The lamps seemed to flicker, and every little noise in the house gave him shivers. The next morning, when he called the phone provider to report a problem, he learned that no one had reported similar problems in the area, and in fact, the number that appeared in his phone was a phone number that had been disabled for months. The phenomenon stopped as sudden as it began, without explanation. But for a long time, every time the phone rang, my father couldn't help but wonder if it would happen again. That was the scary story my father experienced. I don't know what you think, but for him, it's a night we will never forget. If you have experienced something similar, or have had an explanation for this kind of phenomenon, I'd love to read your comments. See you soon. Watch your phones. Did I encounter a cult? To start off, I live in rural southern France. I'm in an area which is at the foothills of the Pyrenees mountain range, and the town closer to the mountains, like all the mountain towns, have weird stuff happening in them. But I live in a sort of flatter area about 30 minutes from there, so paranormal encounters aren't really a thing. The story starts in summer. We're in my smallish town, and my brother and his friends were having a party at an abandoned windmill, right at the top of a hill about 10 or 15 minute walk from my house. They were all going to sleep in tents, so he was all set and just went out. About 2 hours after his departure, he calls me. He says that he left his power bank charger in his room and if I could bring it to him. But, sort of being intimidated by the older brother, I obviously obliged. I wake up, hand it to him briefly, just talk, and I'm off again. Now, the hill is very steep, so I'm rather slow going down, and eventually there's a field or a clearing to the side, and there's like loads of people. They're all dressed like 70s hippies with 2 donkeys and loads of tents. At this point, I'm not really scared, but I'm sort of confused, and in French I say, well, this thing that the narrator can't say because it's French. And then they just don't respond. But they acknowledge my presence where I detect that I'm not wanted. But the bit I don't understand is that this is 2 minutes from the windmill. They weren't there on the way up. I just can't wrap my head around it, and this was 7 years ago. I was 9 at the time, so I said nothing to anybody apart from my brother. They all said that, well, kind of creeped me out, but not really anything else. And the energy I got from them when I greeted me, I got extremely uncomfortable. So I don't know why my brother suggested a cult, but give me some other suggestions and theories. Well, it does check a few cult boxes. A little bit too open-ended, though. Once we saw something flying above us at night. There we were, 2 friends. Me, all at 12 or 13 years, talking shit at night in the sidewalk. I saw above us something flying in circles. It looked like a piece of cloth, like a dementor, but smaller, maybe 5 feet long and 30 feet above us. I didn't said nothing trying to play it cool. I've already told my friends above other supernatural things happening in my house, and I didn't want it to be again something for them to not give a fuck again. The thing is, one of them saw it and asked us to confirm it, and yeah, the 3 of us saw it, and after a few minutes we stopped caring about it. It was 2001. Not one of us had cell phones nor cameras. That's all. Other supernatural things happen in my house. It's like the Hat Man on the door. Sleep paralysis we all suffered at some point. But my mother think that they're demons. A guy puffing a cigar sat between my bed and my sister's bed. Hearing a cutlery drawer falling, but nothing was on the floor. When I was a teenager, some random dude in a group of friends told about my room that he felt something was looking at him from there. A little bit random. My daughter is seeing something. My 26-month daughter, who's 3 years old, is finally talking to her. We can finally understand most of what she says. I recently bought a house and finished moving in. It's a nice, quiet neighborhood outside of our next door, Karen. My sister and my wife said that they heard my daughter talking with somebody in her room. They heard somebody responding to her as well. Upon investigating, there's nobody there. I told them they must have been hearing things, and she just started playing and practicing her speech. 2 days later, I had my first ever case of sleep paralysis. It was 3 a.m. and I was drifting off to sleep. Shortly after I fell asleep, I locked up and felt like I was being laid on. I heard a creepy exhale in my left ear that was really quiet at first and got really loud. I broke myself out of it by screaming, "Babe!" I guess I didn't scream because my wife was still asleep. Never had that happen in houses that were confirmed to be haunted. The following morning, I walked into my daughter's room and not sure if it was the same thing that she'd been talking to because the presence was definitely an angry female. It started speaking to us, addressed the thing. I said that this is my house now and that they aren't welcome. I said that I will not be held down in my own bed and I will not terrify my daughter or talk to her at all. I said that I'm giving it the option to leave on its own, or I'd be calling a priest. This was mainly to give respect to it, since it was human at one point, I wanted to give it that human option. After I finished speaking, the air felt lighter. Nothing happened for a good while. Fast forward 5 months later to tonight. My daughter's been inconsolably crying in her new room. We moved her across the house. I'd been checking on her every hour, making sure that she had what she needed, and nothing was working. My wife came in the room and started talking to her, and she uttered out how she was scared. When we asked what of, she pointed to the upper corner of her room above her bed, and she said, "She's so up there." We said, "Who is she?" Without an answer, I told her to come to me. Face the corner, and she pointed it and tell it to go away. She happily did and turned back to me and was chatting with my wife about it. She turned around and said, "Where'd she go?" So I repeated the question that she asked me. She looked around and said, "She's right there," pointing at the ceiling in between two corners now directly above her bed. I spoke to what I believe now as somebody who might be attached to the house. I thought that we fixed this issue, but I guess I'm going to have to call the priest since you don't want to leave. I told my daughter that if she sees her again to say, "Go away." Left her bedroom light on and gave her some milk, and that seemed to have done the trick to get her to sleep. Anybody have any advice on what this could be? How would I go about explaining this to a priest, and does this even require a priest? So many unanswered questions, but something's scaring my daughter and I want it to stop. Mom asked me to open the door, but it wasn't her. I was about to take a nap on my sofa. I wasn't really tired, just had nothing to do. And that's when somebody buzzed my intercom twice. I ignored it, but since this person insisted and buzzed again, I figured it could be my mom. She had forgotten her keys that day, so I assumed it was her coming back from work. When I asked who that person was, they replied with, "Open, it's Mom." I didn't think anything of it since it was her exact same voice. I heard it clearly. I left the door to her house open and went back to my sofa. While I was waiting for her, at least 5 minutes had passed and nobody came. Thought it was weird and called her. She didn't answer. Got tired and decided to take my nap. When I woke up around an hour later, door still open, I went to check and there's no one in the house. So a couple of hours later she came back from work and I asked for an explanation. She said that by the time I had heard this intercom, it was 4 p.m. and she was at work. I explained that what had happened and she basically just as shocked as me. She then later told me that she'd received an SMS from our local post office saying that the mailman had come by her house, but no one answered. So we thought there was nobody in and left, and at the same time I had heard the intercom and actually answered. My grandparents' house. This took place back in 2019 when I was 11. My grandparents live in a large Victorian-styled home on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The building was made in the late 1800s, so it has that classic old building look to it. Me and my family go down there occasionally from our home up near Bellingham, Washington. And in early September of that year, my family decided that we wanted to pay my grandparents a visit. I was excited to see my grandparents, but not so much to go to that house. Up until that point, nothing out of the ordinary had happened in that house. The only thing it did was sort of creep me out, especially if I was alone. The first day we were there, nothing out of the ordinary happened. My grandparents and I did our annual game of Clue. It's a murder mystery board game. We enjoyed dinner, and that was basically it. But little did I know that when I went to sleep that night that tomorrow would be anything but ordinary. When I got up the next day, I was excited. I was a pretty die-hard Seahawks fan, and today was going to be their first game of the season. Outside, it was warm and muggy, so in my room, which was one of the 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, I had to open the window with the fan on it to let all the hot air out. Later that day, my dad came up to my room and said that he and everybody else was going to go on a walk. I acknowledged him by nodding, glued to the Seahawks game that was on my tablet screen. Then he left, shut the door behind him. What happens next still terrifies me to this day. About 10 minutes later, I heard what I thought to be my mom yelling from downstairs. Somewhat annoyed, I stood up and turned the fan off next to the window to listen to my mom. She was actually calling me. Or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again. My mom was definitely calling my name. I opened the door, frustrated, like I was missing part of the game, and yelled annoyed, like, "Yeah." When there was no response, I yelled down the 3rd floor stairs again, "Yeah." Then my mom called back and said something like, "Want to show you this," or something like that. Couldn't really make out what she was saying. Annoyed, but not wanting to ignore my mom, I hurried down the stairs on the 2nd floor. "Where are you?" I genuinely didn't know where she was. "Here," she said. It sounded like it was coming from the 1st floor. Something was off. Her voice sounded very muffled and very weird. Played it off as just me being paranoid, so I walked down the first floor, now getting a little scared. "Mom," I said. No reply. I searched almost every room and no one was there. That only left one room, the basement. There was no way in hell I was going down there, though. So I started heading back towards the stairs when all of a sudden the basement door swung open. I yelled, spinning around. No one was there. Then I heard footsteps walking down the basement stairs. Someone was definitely there. I then heard my mom say again, "Here," in that same weird voice. I got chills down my spine. Something definitely wasn't right. I turned and ran as fast as I could up the stairs into the second floor. I ran across the kitchen to the narrow staircase that led up to the third floor. Then I stopped dead in my tracks, paralyzed. At the top of the staircase was a shadow-like person without a face. They were saying something in my mother's voice. "Here." I screamed at the top of my lungs and practically threw myself down the stairs and out the front door. I then waited outside near the trees, glancing over my shoulder every 2 seconds before my family finally came back from their walk. When I told them what had happened, they didn't believe me at first. But seeing as I was crying, they looked pretty genuinely freaked out. They told me that they believed me. I don't know if they were telling the truth or if they just wanted me to feel comforted, but either way, there's no way I was sleeping in that building. After about 10 minutes of reasoning with them, I decided it'd be more comfortable if I slept with my parents that night. And this incident still haunts me to this day. I rarely ever sleep in a room alone in that house anymore. Is it normal that I keep seeing things? Since I was like 4 years old, I saw spirits and things that I can't explain. When I was 4, I used to get scared a lot because I didn't understand what they were. I remember when I was staying at my sister's house, I woke up at around 3 a.m. and wanted to use the bathroom. Back then we were in Sudan. People there would sleep outside in their compounds when it's hot. So that night we were all sleeping outside. But to get to the bathroom, we had to use the door to get inside the house through the seating room. I remember seeing many skeleton-looking spirits and figures, and they were all looking at me, as if they knew I could see them. They seemed like they were in like a party or something. I remember seeing many skeletal-looking spirits and, well, I remember refusing and crying to walk through the sitting room, so instead I used the corridor that's like at the compound at the back of the house. I remember when I was in the bathroom, I saw flying toothbrushes. They were leading me to the gate of the house. When I reached the gate of the house, I saw my other sister leaving with my niece. I was so hurt that she left me behind and didn't take me with her, so I ran following her. Thank God my other sister and I was staying at her house. Thank God she came after me, because little did I know that I was chasing spirits disguised as my sister and niece. Then after she took me inside the house, she took me to sleep. But I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing things that I couldn't understand. Eventually I fell asleep, though. Another incident was when I was at my grandma's house. My older brother was going to close the balcony door. I saw a skeleton-looking spirit holding a knife standing where my brother was heading. Another incident was when I was at my grandma's house. My older brother was going to close the balcony door. I saw a skeleton-looking spirit holding a knife standing where my brother was heading. Again. Tell me why my 4-year-old ass ran and tried to take the knife away from the spirit. I literally started fighting with the spirit, but I couldn't hold it. It was staring at me. I tried my best to hold it, to punch it, kick it. Nothing worked, and then it just disappeared. Then after some months, I was at my grandma's place. I heard my grandma and older sister talk about a jinn or a demon figure that used to appear in people's houses in our community. Tell me why the moment they spoke about that jinn or demon, I clearly saw it in my mind. Like, I clearly knew how it looked. Like, what the fuck? Then days after that, I was with my cousin at my grandma's place. She was like 7 years old at the time, and I was still 4. We tried cooking food, but we couldn't, so we decided to sleep. So for a guy from Sudan, this guy's good at curse words, or, liberal with curse words. So my 4-year-old ass, before sleeping, decides to let fire consume the kitchen. Then I instantly fell asleep. I woke up to a very bright light in the kitchen. When I rushed to see what it was, the bright light was the kitchen getting consumed by fire. Like, literally, the whole house was about to get burnt and destroyed. When I was 9, I watched The Legend of Korra. I was very excited, so I decided to practice with Aang, who taught Korra. He taught her wind binding, so I did everything that I saw in the cartoon. Tell me why I ended up controlling wind and pushing by little sister so hard that she flew and fell on her back and ran scared. Then months later, I think I was 11 or something, I was in the balcony alone. I see a baby holding on the door of the balcony and trying to walk, and then the baby just disappeared. Then 2 years from that moment, my older sister and I was just gave birth to a child. 9 months after giving birth, the baby wore the same clothes of the baby that I saw before. He even held onto the balcony and tried to walk the same way the baby I saw years ago did. So, am I able to see into the future? Probably not. But also, since I was a child, I also knew things. If somebody did something and if they're trying to hide, I always knew exactly what they did even though I had no evidence and never even witnessed them doing it. But I always ended up being right. I'm 19 now. I still keep seeing creatures. Sometimes ones that look human but disappear in a moment. Sometimes it's just a shadow, sometimes spirits. I don't know why I see them and why I even hear things are different, like melodies. What the fuck?